Hi, this week we are looking at the Odyssey. The Odyssey is from the archaic period of Greece, as you can see on your screen, and the dates are approximately 750 before the Common Era to 480 BCE. Somewhat of an arbitrary dating. It's not like a clear cut. This happened then, and that's why it's no longer archaic. So it's just helpful for people to have an idea of when certain things were happening, what time period, instead of having a time period of several thousand years, right? So here on this page we have two pictures that are representative of the two famous city-states of Greece, which is Sparta, and of course Sparta is known for its warlike ways, and then the other one is, yes, you're right, it's Athens. And this is the painting, a fresco, I should say, of Raphael, who was, it's called the School of Athens, and it has, of course, a lot of famous philosophers in there, and you could always look it up and, play who's who. So let's just look a little bit at the archaic period. I do have statues from the period, so you can later on contrast it with the Greek statues that you might be even more familiar with, which is much more dynamic, much more human, I suppose, than this period. What you see here is the statues are stiff. They have their hands clasped to the side. They don't show much movement. You begin to see a little bit of the movement over here with the male figure. He's putting one foot forward, but certainly nothing to compare to the more dynamic scenarios we see the human body on when we get into the classical Greek period. Also, take note, one gender is naked, the other one is clothed. What does that tell us about a civilization? And what does it tell us what they think of a certain gender? Well, we also will continue to see this kind of clothing of the female figure into the classical period. There was this kind of prejudice about the female body, that it was not nice to look at. So anyway, we can see that represented in their art. Other things that I would like to point out about the archaic period, this is where we're seeing a lot of advances in the civilization, and then it is still reverberating to us today. We're taking a lot of the ideas that the ancient Greeks gave us and still apply it to modern life, such as political theory. We have the rise of democracy, philosophy, which we'll look at a little bit further on. Theater, of course, again, we'll still see more theater later on in the semester. Poetry, and a lot of the written word. People were becoming a little bit more literate. So it kind of dies down and it comes back, more literacy. So we talked about this a little bit. This is where we get the beginnings of the great Greek political achievement, which is the polis, or the city-state, as we were talking about earlier with Athens and Sparta. So each city-state, however, developed their own unique independent cultures. Again, using those two as an example. Was everybody in Sparta a warrior? No, of course not. But that was kind of what they got known for. It's as the same as not everybody was a scholar in Athens. Now, can we think about modern day when we think of our country, perhaps the United States? What would we think about as unique and independent cultures within our own little city-states? By that I mean states, of course, or regional areas. And I think you can see that even today it holds true. So the Greeks started this. Again, they were not totally united, as our government is, but it was the beginnings of making these political connections through different areas and different cultures. and rule of democracy, demos meaning, of course, rule by the people, where we get the name from, democracy, rule by the people. However, let's not get too happy. Who were the people? The people were free men, right? If you were a slave, no, you're not a person. A foreigner or a woman, of course, they were not involved. And we already talked about Athens and Sparta. So our next slide is actually looking a little bit further at the Odyssey itself. So we are only going to look at small excerpts from the poem, which is, of course, epic and very long. Homer, perhaps, this is who he was. And then also this picture here where shows you the different areas where Odysseus had his adventures, the different islands, etc. So when was it set? The Odyssey was set in Mycenaean Greece, so it was set before it was written. So when it was written, the Archaic period, it's writing about an earlier time. So it wasn't taking place when it was actually written. The narrator, there's an omniscient narrator that is speaking in the third person. However, there are sections, and we will see that in our readings, where Odysseus himself is narrating his story in the first person. So this is an interesting construct. Why? Think about it. When you have an omniscient narrator, that is, the narrator can see all and tell all. When you have reading something in the first person, this is going to skewer their story. So when Odysseus is telling his story, maybe he's making himself out better than he really was, or maybe he's telling fantastic tales. Really, the supernatural stuff happens when Odysseus is telling his story. The guy was missing for 10 years. What was he doing? He came up with an elaborate story. Also, it's kind of comical. It's heroic, but it's also a little tongue-in-cheek. So it's interesting to see if you really delve into it. A lot of people take it as face value, and it's this, great hero. But a lot of his stories and adventures are amusing and quite funny. We also, because of his narration, you're going to see a lot of the poem itself being told in flashback, because what happens is Odysseus is now returning almost home from his adventures, and he is reciting his story. This is interesting because this is like the first time flashback that we know of was utilized in a story. We are really used to that now, but that was, brand new a few thousand years ago. We have the Odyssey begins where the Iliad ends. So you have the fall of Troy, which is the Iliad. And that's like a war story. And of course you have Odysseus there. And then the Odyssey is Odysseus' story. Now we talked a little bit about Homer, and not Homer Simpson, right? He is credited with the story. Did he actually write it? Was that actually Homer? I mean, these things are kind of lost in history. But the poem itself is obviously an oral poem. You will see a lot of repetition, which is what happens when somebody is telling the story orally, because that's a mnemonic device and it allows them to remember, the teller to remember where they are in the story, and it also helps the reader understand and comprehend, because they're not, I said the reader, the listener. The listener is not reading. They have to hear the story. It's the same when we hear speeches. You have repetition, because it's a different way of getting information into our brains. So finally, this is the overall plot. I just put it here because we are going to be looking at such a small touch of the Odyssey, and the story is just so huge. How does it work? It starts 10 years from the Trojan War. Odysseus still has not returned. So his wife Penelope has a bunch of suitors who want to actually take over the kingdom, right? Whereas Odysseus, He's spending, I think it was 5 years with Calypso on her island, and he says he really wants to go home and get away from having sex with this beautiful goddess-like creature, so he has to get home, but he's trapped. She won't let him go. Athena does intervene. She gets Telemachus, which is his son, or Telemachus, to go and start to get his father back. So then Hermes, that god that flies, is sent to the island of Calypso by Zeus, and Odysseus is free. However, because, as we will read, Poseidon is mad because of what Odysseus did against his son, the Cyclops, and wrecks his ship. Well, Athena comes in again, saves Odysseus, and now he goes to the Phoenicians, where he's going to tell the story. After that entire retelling of the story, where we cover all of these fantastic adventures that you might have heard, like the Lotus Eaters. Of course, we're going to read the Cyclops, the affair with Circe, his temptation by the Sirens. This entire journey is being recanted. And some of the, for some of them you already know if you have never read the Odyssey, because it's just permeated into our culture. He returns to Ithaca, and he is now disguised as a beggar by Athena. He encounters his son, and then he says, "This is me, I'm your father," and they both plan a device to kill all of the suitors, which they eventually do. They go back to the kingdom. Penelope is pretty sure that's her husband, but she still sets it up where he has to do a contest with archery, and he's the only one who can do it. So everybody's trying to, sling this bow. Only Odysseus can do it. He does, and then he kills all of the suitors. Then he gets reunited with Penelope, which is what we also read, and then that seems like where the story is, but actually no, because Odysseus was not done with his adventure. He does go and visit his father. The suitors, family members that he had killed, tried to enact revenge on him, but that's okay. He and his dad killed them all, and then Odysseus finally goes home and settles down. And then 20 years of action, I guess, you get a little bit tired. So anyway, that is the entire kind of plot overview of the Odyssey. If you've never read it, or if you've never seen the entire movie, I suggest you do, because, of course, it's just something that is so impermeated into our culture. And that's all we're doing this week.